The day my father was buried, my husband asked me how much the estate was worth. I remember standing in the parking lot of St. Michael's Episcopal, still in my black dress, mascara dried into faint tracks on my cheeks, and he leaned close like he was offering comfort. But what he whispered wasn't "I'm sorry" or "I love you." It was, "Did the lawyer say anything about the property in Asheville?" I should have known then. I should have turned around, walked back inside, and never looked at him the same way again. Instead, I squeezed his hand and told him we'd talk later. That was 18 months ago, and everything that happened after, every document I signed, every phone call I recorded, every night I lay awake pretending to be asleep while he typed on his laptop 3 feet away from me, it all started in that parking lot. My name is Leigh. I'm 37 years old. I was a high school English teacher for 9 years, and I married my husband, whom I'll call my husband because that's the only title he ever earned, when I was 28. His name was Conrad. He was a financial advisor. He wore good shoes and said the right things at dinner parties, and my mother adored him, which in retrospect should have been a red flag because my mother had terrible judgment about men. My father did not adore Conrad, he tolerated him. There's a difference. Dad was a civil engineer from Western North Carolina, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and didn't say much unless it mattered. He built 2 rental properties in Asheville over 30 years, slow, careful, 1 brick at a time, and when he died of a heart attack at 68, he left them to me. Not to us. To me. He had updated his will 6 months before he passed, and I only found out about that detail afterward, when his estate attorney, a quiet woman named Miss Caldwell, called me into her office and slid the paperwork across the desk. "Your father was very deliberate about this," she told me. He specifically requested sole beneficiary designation, no spousal claim. I remember nodding like I understood, but inside I was trying to figure out how my father had known. He never said anything to me. He just knew. The 2 properties were worth, combined, just over $1.4 million. Not life-changing money for a lot of people. But for a teacher from Raleigh whose retirement account had $42,000 in it, and whose husband had been quietly moving their joint savings into a brokerage account she didn't have login access to. It was everything. I didn't tell Conrad the full number right away. I said Dad left me the properties and that they'd need to be assessed. He smiled and said that was wonderful. And that evening he poured himself a bourbon and made a phone call in the garage with the door closed. I stood at the kitchen window and watched him through the glass. That night I went into the hall closet where we kept old tax files and I started pulling folders. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't a suspicious wife by nature. Before Dad died, I thought my marriage was ordinary. Not perfect. Conrad traveled a lot. We argued about money more than I liked. He had a way of dismissing my opinions that I'd convinced myself was just his personality, but ordinary, functional. I wasn't lying awake at night wondering if he was stealing from me, but grief does something strange to your perception. When you lose someone who loved you without conditions, you start measuring everyone else differently. And when I started pulling those tax folders that night, I told myself I was just getting organized, being responsible, taking stock. What I found wasn't dramatic at first. Small things. A brokerage statement addressed only to Conrad for an account I didn't recognize. A deduction for a property management company I'd never heard of. A second cell phone bill folded inside a Costco receipt. I put everything back exactly where I found it. Then I called my college roommate Phoebe, who was a paralegal in Charlotte. I didn't tell her everything. I just said I wanted to understand what my rights were as a spouse regarding inherited property in North Carolina. She gave me the basics and then paused and said, "Leigh, are you okay?" "I'm being thorough," I told her. "That's not what I asked." I drove to Asheville the following Saturday, alone, to meet with Ms. Caldwell again. I told Conrad I was going to walk through the properties and get an emotional sense of things, which was partly true. He kissed me goodbye and said to drive safe. What I didn't tell him was that I had also scheduled a meeting with a forensic accountant that Phoebe had recommended. His name was Mr. Okafor, and he worked out of a small office above a nail salon on Marymount Avenue, and he was the most precise, unhurried person I had ever met. He spent 3 hours with me that day, asking questions in a calm, even voice while taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. At the end, he set down his pen and looked at me. "How long have you been married?" he asked. 9 years. "And you've had joint checking and savings this entire time?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I'll need 60 days. Don't move any money. Don't change any passwords. Don't tell him you've been here. I drove home with the windows down even though it was February because I needed the cold air on my face to keep myself from shaking. Over the two next months, I went about my life with the kind of careful, deliberate calm that I imagine bomb technicians use. I taught The Great Gatsby to juniors who didn't want to read it. I made pot roast on Sundays. I laughed at Conrad's jokes. I listened when he talked about clients and markets and asked intelligent follow-up questions because I had always been interested, and I was not going to let him see that I'd stopped being interested. He brought up my father's properties 4 more times in those 2 months. Each time I said we were still in the probate process and that Miss Caldwell was handling it. Each time he would nod and change the subject a little too smoothly. The 5th time he didn't change the subject. We were washing dishes after dinner, a Tuesday in late March, nothing special about the day, and he set down his dish towel and said, "I think we should talk about what you're going to do with the Asheville properties." "What do you mean, what I'm going to do?" I asked. "Well," he leaned against the counter, "we should probably think about this strategically. The rental market in Asheville is complicated right now. I've been looking at some numbers, and honestly, liquidating might make more sense than holding." I dried a glass and put it in the cabinet. "Miss Caldwell says there's no rush. Caldwell doesn't know the market the way I do. They were my father's properties, Conrad." Something shifted in his face, just a flicker, half a second, and then he smiled and said, "Of course, I just want us to make the smartest decision." There it was. I smiled back. "I'll think about it. Mr. Okafor called me on a Friday morning when I had a free period. I stepped out to my car in the school parking lot and sat in the driver's seat with the heat running. "I have a picture now," he said. "It's not complete, but it's clear enough." Over the next 30 minutes, he walked me through what he'd found. Conrad had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into a sole account, his name only since 2019. Not large amounts at once. Never more than $2,800 at a time, because transfers over $3,000 can trigger bank reviews, small enough to look like ordinary expenses. Over 4 years, it added up to just under $140,000. There was also the matter of Conrad's business partner, a man I'll call his partner, who had co-signed on an LLC that Conrad had formed without my knowledge. The LLC existed, as far as Mr. Okafor could tell, primarily to receive commissions that should have been reported as marital income. "This is financial fraud," I said. "It's potentially that, yes. It's also potentially tax fraud." Mr. Okafor paused. "There's something else. He'd found a mortgage. A property in Wilmington, a beach cottage 18 months ago, financed under the LLC's name. I had never been to it. I had never known it existed. I sat in my car in the school parking lot for a very long time after I hung up. A beach cottage, 18 months ago. That was 2 months before my father died. I thought about Conrad at the funeral reception, refilling his plate at the buffet, and laughing at something my uncle said. I thought about him in the church parking lot, asking about the estate. I thought about Phoebe saying, "That's not what I asked." I drove back inside and I taught the rest of my classes and I graded papers that evening, and I made no sudden movements. Because I understood by then that this was not a situation where anger would help me. Anger was for people who acted without thinking. I had been thinking since February. I intended to keep thinking until I had everything I needed. The following week, I called Miss Caldwell and explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she said she wanted to connect me with a divorce attorney she trusted, a woman named Ms. Hargrove who specialized in complex asset cases. Miss Hargrove was 50-something, wore reading glasses on a chain, Raleigh, with a framed needlepoint on the wall that said, "Document everything." I liked her immediately. She listened to everything I had, Mr. Okafor's findings, the bank statements I'd photographed, the mortgage document he'd located through public records, the LLC filing, the phone bill, the brokerage statements, and she laid it all out on her conference table and looked at it the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. "He's going to come after the Asheville properties," she said. "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means he could argue for a share even of inherited assets if he can claim contribution to their value." "He hasn't contributed anything," I said. "He's never even been to Asheville. That won't stop him from trying." She tapped the LLC document. "This, however, changes the conversation considerably. We're going to file first when? As soon as you're ready." "I've been ready since February," I said. She smiled. "Then, let's get you ready officially." Conrad came home from a client dinner on a Thursday evening in April to find me sitting at the kitchen table with two people he didn't know, Miss Hargrove and a man from the Raleigh field office of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, whose name was Agent Tanner. He stopped in the doorway. He was still holding his car keys. "What is this?" I looked at him. 9 years. The good shoes, the bourbon, the garage phone calls. "Sit down, Conrad," I said. He didn't sit. He looked at Agent Tanner. "I'd like to call my attorney." "That's absolutely your right," Agent Tanner said, in the tone of someone who had heard that sentence many times. "You're not under arrest. You're not required to stay. But I'd encourage you to hear what we have to say." Conrad looked at me. I had known this man for 11 years. I had watched him read the Sunday paper and parallel park and give a toast at my cousin's wedding, and in that moment, looking at me across our kitchen table, he did something I didn't expect. He sat down. I'll give him that. He sat down. Miss Hargrove walked him through the divorce petition I had filed that morning. Then Agent Tanner explained that the IRS had opened a preliminary inquiry into the LLC and the unreported commission income. He was careful, professional, did not overstate what they had. He didn't need to overstate it. Conrad's attorney arrived 40 minutes later, a man in his 50s who'd clearly been pulled away from dinner, because he had a little bit of steak sauce on his collar. He conferred with Conrad quietly in the hallway. Then he came back and said Conrad would be cooperating fully with the inquiry. The beach cottage in Wilmington, it turned out, had been purchased in part with diverted client funds. Conrad's own clients' money, not just ours. That expanded things considerably beyond a divorce filing. I did not watch when they left. I sat at the kitchen table, and Phoebe, who had driven up from Charlotte and been waiting at my neighbor's house the whole time, came over and made me a cup of tea and didn't say anything for about 20 minutes, which was exactly what I needed. The next 4 months were not clean or simple. Divorce proceedings never are. Conrad's attorney tried to argue that the Asheville properties had appreciated in value during our marriage and therefore had a marital component. Miss Hargrove dismantled that argument with a detail I hadn't even known to look for. My father had updated his will to include a clause specifying that the properties were to remain solely in my name and exempt from marital claims under NCGS 5020. His estate attorney had advised him on exactly how to do this. My father, who never said much unless it mattered, had spent $800 in legal fees to protect me from a man he'd never said a single word against. I had to sit in Miss Hargrove's waiting room for about 10 minutes after she told me that. The IRS investigation moved separately from the divorce and on its own timeline as federal investigations do. Conrad ultimately reached a settlement agreement with the agency, which I was not party to and do not know the full terms of, except that it involved substantial back taxes, penalties, and the forced liquidation of the LLC. His securities license was suspended pending review by FINRA, which meant he could no longer work as a financial advisor while the investigation was ongoing. The beach cottage was sold. I don't know where the proceeds went. I didn't ask. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday morning in August. I wore a blue dress because it was a hot day, and I drove myself to the courthouse and drove myself home. Conrad's attorney handled the signing. Conrad wasn't there. I didn't know where he was, and I didn't wonder about it. I kept my dad's properties, both of them, the duplex on the north side of Asheville, and the single family on the south end that he'd rented to the same couple for 11 years. I drove up in September, the first weekend after school started, and walked through both of them for the first time properly. Not in a hurry, not with an agenda, just room by room, looking at the things my father had built and maintained. The duplex needed a new roof on the north unit. The single family had a screen door that stuck. There was a particular way the afternoon light came through the kitchen windows of the second unit that reminded me so specifically of the house I grew up in that I had to stand there for a minute before I could move on. I called the property management company my father had used and talked to a woman there named Ms. Varela, who had worked with him for 6 years and knew both properties well. She was matter-of-fact and competent and talked to me like I was capable of making decisions, which I appreciated more than I could say. I made a plan for the roof. I put in a work order for the screen door. On the drive back to Raleigh, I stopped for gas outside of Hickory and stood at the pump in the late afternoon sun. And I thought about all the moments in the past year and a half when I had wanted to scream or cry or confront Conrad directly, every dinner I'd sat through, every question I'd deflected, every night I'd pretended to sleep while he was 3 feet away and I was counting the ways he had lied to me, and I thought about how I hadn't done any of those things. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that none of them would have given me what I actually needed. What I actually needed was to still be standing, and to still have the properties, and to have made every decision deliberately, with clear eyes, while he had made his with greed, and the assumption that I wasn't paying attention. I filled my tank and got back in the car and drove home. Phoebe texted me that evening. "How was Asheville?" I typed back, "Good, roof needs work. Dad picked good tenants." She sent back a heart. "Then you okay?" I set my phone on the counter and looked out the kitchen window. Not at a garage this time. Just at the yard, going golden in the early September light, the way yards do when the summer is finally starting to let go. "Yeah," I typed. "I think I actually am. The properties are still mine. The tenants renewed their leases. I'm teaching The Great Gatsby again this fall, to a new group of juniors who don't want to read it, and every year the same student asks me why Gatsby doesn't just tell Daisy the truth from the beginning. I never used to have a good answer for that. I think I do now.